Hi everyone, how are you tonight? Are you ready for another edition of Meanor Studios? We're going to look at U.S. history. A friend of mine asked me the other day, hey, could you tell us something about American history from 1800 to 1900? I said, well, I'll do my best. Well, here we go, folks. We're going to go for a little bit of a ride. If it seems like we're going on a roller coaster, well, please forgive me because, hey, sometimes I can talk so fast I can't even hear myself talk. Ha ha, it's a joke. Anyway, here it comes, folks. 1800 to 1900. Well, look, the tragedy is this. The Civil War happened right in the middle of the 1800s, or 1860s to 1864. We fought amongst ourselves over a couple really horrific issues. Slavery is one, and states' rights is another. And that tore our country apart until the point where we finally found unity after the North defeated the South, but we lost the president, Abraham Lincoln, in an assassination. So pretty tragic, very tragic stuff. But on the way to that, a few other things did happen. One, 1803. Now, pay attention closely. 1803, you had something called Marbury versus Madison. You say, what in the world is a Marbury versus Madison? Why, ironically, it is the first time the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, actually declared a law unconstitutional. You see, there's this guy who was appointed to a position in the federal government by one president. When a new president came along, he didn't want the guy, and he refused to issue the writ. And the court said, "Hey, we can't issue a writ." Declared the whole law invalid. First time ever in American history, a court, the U.S. Supreme Court, declared a law unconstitutional. That was called judicial review. Then we go on. Let's look at a few other things that happened between 1800 and 1900. 1823, we had the Monroe Doctrine. What's the Monroe Doctrine? It was a decision that not any foreign land would land on the same hemisphere as belonged to the United States. That was a true doctrine until the very unfortunate experience of Cuba's rebellion and revolution of the 1950s. Up until then, that doctrine stayed true, the Monroe Doctrine. Then you had, in 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons versus Ogden was where the federal government decided that there's something called interstate commerce, and only the federal government can regulate that. Then you had another very, very important event, an event that also was important to U.S. history. It was called the Second Great Awakening. Now, for those of you who are trying to figure out what could be a Great Awakening, it is a revival. It is where people across this nation decide, you know what? It's time to put God first. Now, for Americans, it was Christianity, the belief in Jesus. People turned to Jesus in a way that hadn't been seen in hundreds of years. That caused a massive revival across the nation, and thus a great awakening across the nation, so that issues like slavery and women's rights became very important. Women started to believe that, you know what, I'm not just something to be at home. I have a right to work. I have a right to vote. I have a right to property. Women's rights came out of that. The abolition movement came out of that, with the fact that African Americans have a right to be free. And there was also the Women's Christian Temperance Union that later in the century was very much a part of our landscape. And it's because women were tired of seeing alcohol being so much a part of their daily lives, with their husbands working hard during the day and drinking too much at night. So they said, you know, we got to curb this alcohol stuff. So you had a temperance movement that started, and it all can go back to the Great Awakening. There was even some suggestion that the reforms in education came from the Great Awakening. So you can see a lot took place because of that amazing revival during the early part of the 19th century, or 1830s. Then The charter of the First National Bank happened. It was renewed in 1817 because it had to be. It actually expired in 1817, and it was one big battle for renewal. War of 1812. Cumberland Road was open. 1818. Panic of 1819. What's a panic? Well, in the old days, before the depressions came, bank panics were these really bad situations where someone would start a rumor in the community saying, hey, you know what? I heard this company is going bust. It may not have been true, but what happened was people started taking money out of their banks. And as a result, the banks started losing their money and they started panicking. That's why it was called a bank panic. And so when the banks started to lose money, other companies started to lose their money. They pulled their money out, and suddenly the economy was at a standstill. Bank panics happen every 20 years because it was like a boom and bust cycle. For a while, it was booming, and then for a while, it bust. So the Great Panic of 1819. Then you have Mcculloch versus Maryland, where you had it was the federal government and the state had a little fight over who had the power to tax. It all involved the bank tax, and the federal government said, "Hey, federal government supersedes the local government." So Mcculloch versus Maryland was a big constitutional decision, again happening in 1819. Another thing that happened in 1819 was important was the Missouri Compromise. In the Missouri Compromise, and this was a part of the westward expansion that was happening in America. We were moving west, and as a result, we were bringing in territories. Well, Missouri, all these areas wanted to become a state. So in order to make it happen, remember, slavery was a looming issue. So what did they do? In the Missouri Compromise, they allowed Maine to come in as a free state. Missouri came in as a slave state, and then every state above the 3630 parallel would be free, and those below would be slave. That was a compromise. That's why they called it a Missouri Compromise. Then we continue on. Am I going too fast for you? I'm sorry. I'm trying to get this all in for you. Well, anyway, we got, we keep on going. And then in 1831, remember we had the problem with slavery? Well, in Virginia, a man named Nate Turner decided, you know what? Enough is enough. He started a rebellion of slaves in a county in Virginia, Southampton or Suffolk County, I can't remember which one it was, where over 50 people died, over 50 white folks were killed. And it was slaves breaking loose. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it was just one of those birth pangs that America experienced, basically letting us know that slavery couldn't last any longer. We were tired of it, and there was going to be something that would come to change things. Then you had the Fugitive Slave Law, 1850. That was actually a part of the Great Compromise of 1850. What was that all about? Compromise of 1850. You had California come in as a free state. You had New Mexico and Arizona were kind of states where popular sovereignty was okay. You could vote for what you wanted. And again, they continued. They introduced something called the Fugitive Slave Law, or Fugitive Slave Act, where it became especially important to keep slaves. The protections on slave owners were increased. The penalties for it was basically taking the rights away from the slaves. Now, that was 1850. In 1854, you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What did that do? Well, you have to understand that in those days, as the country was expanding, people were grabbing onto land. And the people who wanted to get land were farmers. And the bankers also were interested in that. But there's a problem here. You got people wanting to move in, but you got all these, do you go here where it's free, or do you go here where it's slave? And so they came up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which it opened up what's called popular sovereignty, where people could vote. Well, that made it really fun because people were going in there, both slave and free, battling it out. It was so bad it was called Bloody Kansas. Okay, take a deep breath. We've been flying through this century. It's been a lot. You there? Are you with me still? Come on. Come on. You'll be okay. We'll get through this. Hang in there. All right. So you had to remember 8 Compromise of 1850. Then in 1854, you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, now what else do we go look at here? We know we had the awful thing. Oh, how can I forget nullification? I better not forget that. Around 1828, we go back a little bit, 1828, Andrew Jackson was president. And he was a rough rider, man. That guy was his own guy, and no one told him what to do. Kind of sound familiar today? Anyway, won't get in there. But, excuse me. But anyway, he decided to pass a tariff. Why? Because he wanted business to get a little bit of an upper edge. Their industry needed a boost, so he pushed for a tariff. The only problem was those tariffs were affecting the farmers, and especially South Carolina did not like them. They got to the point where they said, "Okay, you pass a law, federal government, we're not going to enforce it," and they didn't for a couple of years. It's called the Nullification Crisis. The Nullification Crisis, especially centered around South Carolina, where they said, we're not going to enforce these tariffs. They called the tariffs the tariff of abominations. Well, as would be the case, everybody kind of squabbled for a while. Then finally in 1833, there came a compromise, and South Carolina backed off its nullification actions. We got back on track, but still, folks, it's 1833. We're moving toward war, and it's unfortunate, but we are. Well, as you know, as we said, we had the Compromise of 1850. We had the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What else did we have? Well, we had the Civil War, which we all know what happened there, where the Union soldiers defeated the Confederates. The Confederates did form their own country for a brief time. Jefferson Davis was president for a little while, but then they lost. And it was some credit General George Sherman's march to Atlanta, where it was called Burning Atlanta, where he literally took the city and went all the way down to the coast. That was considered a turning point in the war. And after the Civil War, we started Reconstruction. We started rebuilding. We had the unfortunate assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and then we had the 13th Amendment, which made slavery illegal. And then we started entering a period where America was starting to boom economically. The Industrial Revolution was really taking hold. And as a result, working conditions became an issue. As a result, long hours became an issue. What kind of work environment do you live in? Things like that became an issue. This is more like 1870s, 1880s. People also started to enjoy a different kind of culture, poetry and beautiful readings. And some of the famous poets of years gone by, Edgar Allan Poe, even though he was 1830s, became popular again. So we had a resurgence of culture and just kind of escape type life, because we were now in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Oil companies started to form. Standard Oil was forming. Industry was booming. America was booming. It was quite a time. Now, there is a couple other things here. I hope I can remember what they are here. Oh, almost forgot. Back in the 1800s, early part of the 1800s, a couple things took place. You had the Eli Whitney creating the cotton gin. And then also we had the steamboat made by Robert Fulton. The steamboat helped people move along faster, and the cotton gin created cotton more economically, which did what? Made the cotton industry more profitable, which caused a greater demand for cotton, which in turn caused people to need more slaves. So the cotton gin actually put a greater demand for slaves on the South. Now remember, this happened in the 1830s. I'm going back and forth a little bit, so I don't get you too confused. Take a deep breath. You ready? Okay. So I think we've covered everything. Let me go over and just double check it all real quick just to make sure. Monroe Doctrine, give us both the first object, Second Great Awakening, Fugitive Slave Act. Remember that Fugitive Slave Act basically took away rights that Africa slaves had when they got escaped. That's what the Fugitive Slave Act, and made it easier to capture them. Compromise 1850 brought in California. It also brought New Mexico and Arizona as free popular sovereignty states. 1852, we had Uncle Tom's Cabin. What else we got here? See what else I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Well, hey, if I forgot something, I'll make sure I. Oh! How could I forget? Hey, folks, it's Wednesday night. What do you think? Here it goes. Dred Scott. Oh man, I must be. I gotta wake up here. 1857. Dred Scott versus Sanford. What was that? That essentially said blacks had no rights. They had no right to freedom. If they were escaped, they had to go back to their owner. Pretty rotten decision. Here, the Supreme Court realized how bad the decision was. But in 1857, this was huge because, once again, it was one more thing that stimulated the reason why we went to war. You had the Underground Railroad, too. What was that? Harriet Tubman. Beautiful lady who herself was enslaved, escaped with her brothers through a series of tunnels and houses and churches and businesses where people snuck out of the South, got into the North, called the Underground Railroad. That lasted for 50 years. But people were getting out as quick as they could, and Uncle Tom's Cabin was written about the escaping of slaves, gaining freedom. And Harriet Tubman was the one, I think was Harriet Tubman that wrote that book. That was it Harriet Tubman who wrote that book? Anyway, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a popular. There was that. I'm getting names mixed up a little bit here because it's late at night. But anyway, one other thing. And by the way, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book. I had to tell you, I'm off the top of my head. Just look up Harriet Tubman real quick because I think I'm not sure she wrote that or she's the one that escaped as a slave. Either one, they're both important. And then you got Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who later in the 19th century, 1869, formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. Very important ladies in the move for women's freedom to vote, freedom to do more, freedom to get out there and be wonderful ladies. Whew. Boy, I don't know how much time it took, but I hope you got everything out of it. If you have questions, well, send me a note. I'll try to answer it for you. Did you get all that? Come on now. I know it's fast, but I tried my best. Just do your best in the test, okay? I know you can do it. God bless. Thanks for joining me. See you later.